gel, those 20 or gel, is that like wax? Is that the equivalent of wax?
It's it is the same as black wax, but it's cut with xylitol, which is a precursor to silicon oil. And they used to use just the xylitol, but it's relatively low viscosity right now. And that was their winterizing oil. And now their gel is they can just
It takes we don't need the wax from it.
no, no. It's half or three quarters of that, but it does the same stuff as the wax.
Ken made a good point. He said if we had more time, I thought about synthetic on a good
But it would be pretty
because you're older. You're focusing on curves.
it would be perfect. It'd be a perfect
I
synthetic.
mean, Ken makes sense.
Yeah.
Because you're focusing on curves.
You guys ready?
Sure. Well, that was the argument. Synthetic would be that's just the
Because you're focusing on curves.
yeah.
So if you have to come up with
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Equine Industry Program, the College of Business here at the University of Louisville, welcome to our first panel of the Fall 2019 Speaker Series. Very glad to have you here with us tonight. We've got a great panel for you. If you would do me all a favor at this point, would you please silence your cell phones so that we don't have any distractions while this great panel's educating us tonight. I'd like to take a moment also to welcome people that are joining us remotely tonight. We've got the Equine Science Department at Western Kentucky University, the Equine Science Department at Murray State University, and our friends at Equine Studies at Midway College. And of course, this event is being streamed tonight, so special thanks to our friends at Horse Racing Nation who are streaming the event live for us this evening. Thanks for doing that, Mark. Well, we have a great topic for you tonight to kick things off with, and I want to introduce our moderator. I'm going to turn it over to him, and then we'll have some questions later on after we get towards the end of the session. So Jim Mulvihill is the Senior Director of Betting Information at Churchill Downs, Inc., where he served as publisher of the Brisnet Betting Guide, a daily book of past performances and other data for serious horse players. Prior to joining CDI, he spent 5 years as Director of Media and Industry Relations, say that 3 times, at the NTRA, the National Thoroughbred Racing Association. As the head of the NTRA Communications, he was the primary media contact and spokesperson for NTRA initiatives, including the Eclipse Awards and the National Horse Players Championship. Communications positions within and outside of racing, including heading the press offices at Fairgrounds, Racecourse and Slots, the New Orleans Museum of Art, and the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. Mulvihill started his career at Lone Star Park, and he served as staff writer and media relations assistant for 4 years through the Breeders' Cup season of 2004. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm round of applause for our panel tonight. I'm turning it over to Jim now.
Thank you, Sean, for that kind introduction, and thank you also for establishing this new series and giving horse racing a new form for an open exchange of ideas, which we can always use more of. This topic, of course, couldn't be more timely. Everyone in racing finally seems to agree now that the horse needs to come first in everything that we do and every business decision that's made. And what could be more essential to the safety of the horse than the integrity of our racing surfaces? And we're fortunate tonight to have 3 esteemed experts on racing surfaces with us. And those are, of course, Dr. Mick Peterson, Director of the University of Kentucky Ag Equine Programs, Jamie Richardson, the track superintendent at Churchill Downs, and Chip Bach, General Manager of Turfway Park. The way I'm going to do this is I will give each of them a more proper introduction and give them a few minutes to sort of set the stage with some opening thoughts about the state of racing surfaces or their specific racing surface, as well as how they've seen surfaces evolve in their time in the industry. Once they do that, then I'll go back and follow up with some more pointed questions based on what they tell us initially. After that, I'll have a few questions for all three of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to you all, as well as the people watching the stream, if they have any questions. So, without further ado, let's get to our experts. I'm going to start with Dr. McPeterson, as I said, Executive Director and Co-founder of the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory and Director of the UK Ag Equine Programs, which is the multidisciplinary program that touches on all equine activities at UK in the College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, where he is also the Dixon Professor of Equine Science and Management. That's a lot of titles. Before coming to Kentucky, Dr. Peterson served as a mechanical engineering professor at the University of Maine, where his research linked engineering mechanics and materials with the biomechanics of animals. He's also served as an assistant professor at Colorado State and a postdoc research associate at Northwestern. And in the past 20 years, he's become the foremost expert on improving racing surface consistency for the safety of horses and riders. McPeterson, thank you for being here. If you could just give us some initial thoughts on where surfaces have come in the time that you started researching it and looking into it seriously.
Well, when I first became involved in this, the questions were fairly straightforward. We were looking at the differences between surfaces and, well, I'll tell a short story, and that will give you an idea where we stood on this 25 years ago, or almost 30 years ago when I first started working on this. How I got involved in racing surfaces, I did not come from a racing background, but I was working on bone imaging technology, and we were doing research on exercise-induced arthrosis in the racehorse at Colorado State. I was a mechanical engineering professor and assistant professor, and all the initial work that had been done on this experimentally was done with treadmills. We began to write the second stage of the study, and it was going to be done using a training track, a more physiologically representative surface. At that point, the engineer in the room with a bunch of veterinarians said, if we're going to be able to reproduce this study, we need to be able to characterize the surface. And so this was more than 25 years ago. I asked 5 veterinarians who were very familiar with the racing industry, what were the standards that were used in the thoroughbred racing industry for the surfaces? And I said, we need to match those standards in our experiment. And that was the rabbit hole that I went down when I found out that there were no standards in place at all, and so we ended up, instead of writing a proposal on imaging and exercise-induced arthrosis on physiologically representative surfaces, we instead wrote 2 proposals, one on exercise-induced arthrosis, and the other one was on how do we characterize the surface so that we could repeat the study. So I would say where we're at right now is we've now got over 100 different racing and training surfaces that we have taken data on. These surfaces are pretty much from all over the world. We characterize the materials, and we're to the point now where we have an integrated maintenance quality system that 14 of the leading racetracks participate in fully, and we have made a lot of progress, and we're at the point now where we're actually looking at ASTM standards for some of the tests. So we've made a lot of progress, but there's been a lot of changes in the industry over those 25 years. If you think about what we were looking at, even the size of the industry, there's a lot of changes and a lot of challenges. We need to step up and continue to engineer.
Excellent, thank you for that. And Mick spends a lot of time consulting with racetracks around the country, but fortunately we've got Jamie Richardson here to give us the context of what actually happens on the ground at a racetrack day by day. Jamie is only the 5th track superintendent at Churchill Downs in the past 100 years, overseeing the 1-mile main track, over which the Kentucky Derby's been run since 1875, as well as the 7-furlong Matt Winn turf course. He came to Churchill as assistant track super in 2012 before taking over for David Lair in 2015. From 1989 to 2008, he was track super for the Maryland Jockey Club, which includes Pimlico Racecourse, home of the Preakness. And he also served as track superintendent at Oaklawn before coming to Louisville. So Jamie, thank you for being here. And if you would just maybe give us some initial thoughts on the evolution of track maintenance since you've been doing it.
Yeah, I would agree with Mick, very much so. Second his comments there. When I started working racetracks in 1986, so that's 33 plus years ago. Started in the middle of 1986, and the standards with which we look for in materials and the stringent, numbers, material, the makeup of the material, the equipment we use is significantly further advanced than it would have been then. I look back and I kind of just, I chuckle at myself. I'm like, today that would be archaic. I mean, what we did back then. But that was just what everybody did. I'm not saying that makes it right. It was just a different time. And today, we're just much more stringent on materials we use, keeping track of those materials, taking readings, moisture, the turf course shear and penetration with a going stick, moisture readings on the turf. It's grown by leaps and bounds in that 30 plus years.
And one thing we'll talk more about with Jamie is just sort of the art versus science of track maintenance. No matter how much science you have, there are so many factors that can go into changing the makeup of a course or the way that it's performing, not just day to day, but hour to hour, based on your geographic location and the weather that's happening and the shadows that are falling on your racetrack. And we want to get into all of that with him because no amount of science can really compensate for having somebody with the experience like Jamie has. But with that said, I want to check in with Chip Bach. Chip is the general manager of Turfway Park and has been since 2012. And he's worked at Turfway in a variety of leadership roles for 20 years, including as director of operations, since first joining the track as its director of HR in 1999. In 2005, Turfway became the first track in North America to install a polytrack surface, which is an all-weather synthetic surface, and they renewed their commitment to polytrack with a $500,000 renovation in 2013. The track is consistently ranked among the safest in the country in terms of its catastrophic injury rate, and the surface is widely credited as the primary reason for that. So Chip, thank you for being here. You're obviously here because of your experience specifically with synthetic surfaces. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that history and how it's evolved over the years.
Sure. So I started at Turfway Park in 1999 and knew little about racing. I actually grew up in Versailles, Kentucky, which in Woodford County we grow a lot of racehorses there. But I moved to Boston and started working for a computer company. A friend of mine was president of Turfway and asked me to work for him. So I had very little industry knowledge when I hit the floor at Turfway. And one of the things, we had a dirt track at the time, and because we race December through later March, early April, Cincinnati, northern Kentucky area has a variety of different weather systems that affect it during that time. And one of the things I noticed when I first worked there, how frustrating it was with the racetrack, because when it was a dirt track, you'd get a lot of snow. The snow would be blended into the track, and then all of a sudden the sun would shine the next day, except for where it was shaded by the track. So the outside of the racing oval would be soup, the inside would be frozen solid. Obviously, transitioning from a soupy track to a hard track is not a good thing for a horse to do. And so we ended up canceling, we just canceled a lot of racing based on if we had some bad luck with weather, up and including tearing the entire surface off during the meet and putting a new surface down. So 2004, it was a particularly bad night. We had a jockey named Mike Rowland who was racing with us, and there was one of the horses in front of him broke down. His horse broke down, and Mike was a fatality on the racetrack. We lost the jockey. And up until that point, I probably looked at racing as in a different light. It was interesting, it was fun, it was exciting sport, but that was the day we all understood what was at stake every time one of these people jumped up on a horse, whether it be in the morning for workouts or whether it be during live racing. And something I'll still never forget, an experience I'll never forget. The next year, we were offered to be the first racetrack in North America to put polytrack down. And of course, catastrophic breakdowns. Has anybody witnessed a catastrophic breakdown on a racetrack? Okay, they're brutal. They're the ugliest of ugly, and to happen to such a beautiful creature. And so, you know, those are obviously the last thing anybody in the industry wants to have occur at their racetrack. Well, polytrack came in 2005, and lo and behold, I think our first year we had 0, which was amazing. It held, and we'll talk about it a little later, but that's kind of my context of going from the dirt and the trials and tribulations we had with a dirt track in the wintertime to the track that we have now that's evolved with the help of Dr. Peterson at Turfway Park.
And we'll talk to Chip more about, you know, both sides of why a synthetic surface can be advantageous, and what you hear most about these days is the safety record of it, but we're here to talk about the business of racing as well. And obviously, if you run winter race dates, a synthetic surface can keep you racing more. You're not losing dates because of heavy snow and rain quite as often. It handles the freezing temperatures better. So there are obviously huge business incentives for those tracks that race in the winter. But now, Mick, I want to follow up with some questions for you based on what you started it off with. I think for everyone's knowledge here, it would be helpful if you maybe just told us a little bit more about the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory, what exactly they do, and what impact it's had on various surfaces that you've monitored or consulted on.
Well, the way I look at what our role is in the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory, and it's actually a very exciting period of time right now. We've got some preliminary commitments and some discussion about some pretty dramatic expansion of what we're doing in order to better serve the industry. And we've had industry commitments that are very exciting. But what I look at our role as being is we are the engineering back office or the technical support. You know, Jim mentioned talking about art versus science, and you know, if you look at a surgeon, let's say you're doing a heart bypass, and there is obviously technique involved in that. That's when we're dependent on the expertise and the experience of people like Jamie. It also doesn't mean that you turn off the ultrasonic imaging equipment when you're just as you're putting the stent in for that at that last moment. So what we're doing is we're providing the additional information. So Jeff Chapman at Turfway or Jamie Richardson at Churchill has more information to make their decisions. It's like a surgeon making that decision on where they're going to place the stent. In this case, it's, are we going to put another load of water down? When are we going to switch from a float to a harrow and then back to a float? That information is absolutely critical. So if you think about the pieces that go into that, the first thing that the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory does is we work with the superintendents before the race meet to say, this surface is ready for racing. Now that doesn't mean that you can quit looking at it, quit harrowing it, quit watering it. You know, you'll still have to grade it every day in order to, because dirt moves downhill. But what we're saying is you've got the right material, you've got the right equipment, your base is intact, and your tools are in place. You've got the toolkit to go. So that's really the surgical nurse setting up the surgical suite before the surgeon walks into the rooms, and we're backing them up and providing the engineering support for that. There's a secondary piece to that, though keeping the surgical analogy alive here for a minute, is one of my favorite books I've ever used, and I've passed it around to a lot of superintendents. It's called the Checklist Manifesto. And what it is it talks about surgical outcomes being improved when you document them and when every step is documented. And the best case is it's not the surgeon documenting it, it's a really assertive well-established other person in the surgical suite, usually a nurse, who's got the list, who's keeping track of how many sponges came out. So what we're doing here is we're making those moisture measurements, we're helping provide the support, and then there's somebody internal at the racetracks, and some tracks have a full-time position now that's responsible for taking the data and providing it in real time to the superintendent. This is a change, and this is really the evolution of this, and we can make mistakes on how we maintain a track. But the critical thing is we need to learn from every one of them, because society has changed and the expectations of safety have changed. They're going to continue to evolve, and what we need to do is provide better tools to support the superintendents making those critical decisions. So that's what the Racing Services Testing Laboratory does. And the other the part that I'm passionate about right now is we can't accept the status quo. We've got to continue to improve it. And we've seen the dramatic improvement in catastrophic injuries in synthetic surfaces, but we also look at these dirt surfaces. The recently completed race meet at Del Mar we had 0 catastrophic injuries during the race. I mean, that's a dirt surface. We've got the potential there. We need to make every race meet like the Del Mar meet and make those events where there's a catastrophic injury so vanishingly rare that we really don't even have to talk about it.
And you're one of the people that's helping to do that with the Racing Surfaces Laboratory. But like a lot of things in racing, there isn't necessarily anybody that's forcing racetracks to work with you. So can you just give us an idea of who are your clients, how many racetracks use the laboratory, and is it enough?
Well, we're growing, and honestly, part of the problem has been the size of the laboratory and the size of the resources, and that's why this is a particularly exciting moment right now. The other thing to keep in mind with catastrophic injuries, and I will say this now, and I hope you give me a chance to say it again later on, it's also multi-factorial. This is a team process, and what you've seen during the Del Mar meet, I think, is indicative of that. It's the pre-race exams, it's the way the races are written, it's the management of the racetrack. It is a cultural change in the racing industry that will protect our athletes, both human and equine. And the racetrack maintenance is a part of that. And what we've seen when we have a situation like the winter meet at Santa Anita is, I think what we're seeing is a change in the industry. I think that culture change. And honestly, there may be some tracks that don't change, and if they don't change, I don't know what their future looks like. And so, but we've got a responsibility, and I think people who care about racing and are racing fans have a critical role in that to support those tracks, because it's a huge undertaking to change the culture and institute this culture of safety and integrity.
And also briefly, can you just explain how your lab at UK complements the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory, which existed before you came to Kentucky? What new work are you doing in Kentucky that isn't part of the Racing Surfaces Laboratory?
Yeah, so the challenge is, how do we change the status quo? And when we look at the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory, what its role is in the industry is to support the racetracks to provide best practices maintenance of the surfaces, using all the tools that are available. But what I'll tell you right now is the tools are inadequate. And part of that is Jim's example also when he started talking about the art, which couldn't have been queued up any better than he did, because he's talked about the shadows and the change of the race car. One of the projects we're working on right now is the ability to measure moisture in the racetrack in real time as the track's maintained during the race car. If you take a particularly challenging track like Santa Anita, where you might have a sealed track after training in the morning because of morning rains, but if you have the experienced superintendent can look at the track, see how the horses are running. Again, if we use the surgical analogy, it's like, yeah, they need more information. We've got to make it easier on that, and that doesn't replace the expertise. What it does is it supplements the decision making. So those edge cases that you might have missed are the right decisions. So the role of the laboratory, which was led by a gift by NTRA Charities to create this laboratory at the University of Kentucky, is what is that next generation of tools that we're going to develop to support the Jamies and the Jeff Chapmans of the world, because we don't have them, and there's no other place than Central Kentucky that you would ever have the strength of a research university sitting in a state where there's a multi-billion-dollar equine industry that really cares and is passionate. So I look at it as an economic development opportunity for Kentucky, providing these tools to the worldwide. At the same time, we look at what we're doing to protect one of our signature industries.
Now, some of these things that you're talking about, they require some degree of specialized knowledge, and I know you're also an advocate of continuing education for track maintenance staff. You know, Jamie's got 25 people, I think, that work for him at Churchill Downs. This is no longer a profession where you're just driving a tractor around. This is going to require computer competence and maybe some science and engineering ability too. So what does that workforce look like now, and what will it have to be in 10 years from now? I think about like the programs that exist for people who are going to be golf course superintendents, and they go and get degrees in that because it's so specialized now. Do we need that in horse racing?
Well, and I think the challenge is, we've joked about recruiting in the dairy industry because that's the only industry where we could recruit employees who thought it was really great to get Monday and Tuesday off, and they feel like it was a part-time job. So the real challenge we're facing in the horse racing industry is this is a long, hard job. It requires long hours, and holidays aren't holidays. They're a busy workday. So racing is interesting because, you know, we do very well when we look inside the fence because we find people who have the passion for the industry and care enough about the industry to work the kind of hours that Jamie does and Jeff Chapman. I think Chip and I work more normal hours, but if you're responsible for training in the morning, you certainly have to have a passion for it. Where I think we need to go with that is combining that with the tools. And we've got some people. There's an assistant at Keeneland who came out of one of the racetrack program and is passionate about racing and is comfortable with computers. The other part of that is, I think if you've got the passion, we can teach them the technology they need. There's no substitute for caring, and that's really the path we're going down, is looking at supporting the people who are there. Actually, next week there's two of the Tier 1 racetracks are sending their superintendents on their 2 dark days to Lexington to spend the day working through the tools and being trained on the tools. So the timing, again, it's an exciting moment when we have the commitment from the industry to fly in their superintendents to say, what's the best practices, and then we'll send them back with a armload of tools to do what they're doing. We're seeing this cross-fertilization where it's really learning on the ground. And Jamie, we were just talking right before this talk, Jamie's in the loop on that. He knows the people,
Well, and now we'll move on to Jamie then, because he can speak a little bit more to some of the things you've been talking about and what it looks like at Churchill Downs in practice. Before I ask you something like that, though, I do just want to clarify, since Mick brought it up and we do have some students in the room, can you also just explain for everybody floating the track versus harrowing the track? We don't want to get too deep in the terminology that casual fans might not get.
Well, harrowing is loosening the surface, the top surface, and making it softer for the horses to hit. Leveling it takes the hoof prints out, and you're scratching up the top 2.5 to 3 inches, and giving them a good loose cushion to hit with. Then they have the sub base, the base underneath. Floating is sealing to keep the water out of it, so that the water basically hits and then runs off. The tracks are banked. You have drainage to the inside, and some tracks have crowns, where you have 2/3 to the inside, 1/3 to the outside. The water runs off basically the same as a road would be. Roads have crowns so the water drains off and doesn't pool on them.
So floating and sealing are 100% synonymous. There's no.
Yes,
Okay.
I would. You can seal with a roller too. We will not use a roller during the races. We would do that before the races or after the races. Basically, you roll a fast surface. Once they get so wet, the roller will not go over them. But if we will roll, number one, to hold moisture in, and basically to even up the cushion too, because then when you cut it the next day, you're cutting an even cushion, so you don't get deep spots, hard spots in the track. You'll seal it. You can seal it with a roller. So I guess I should make that clear. You can seal with a roller or a float, but when we're sealing during racing, it's with a float.
Got it. Okay. Now I was hoping that you could just tell us more about how you work with Mick. The things that he's doing and consulting on at your racetrack. How do you then put them into practice, and what sorts of things does he offer that if Mick Peterson and the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory and his UK laboratory didn't exist, just wouldn't be available?
Well, that's sort of what I alluded to prior, that, how we've grown by leaps and bounds. Mick will come in multiple times a year before our meets, and he has ground penetrating radar to make sure he checks the sub-bit grade and the base and make sure that everything seems consistent under there, no irregularities. He has a mechanical hoof tester that tests impact, so we'll harrow the track up when he does that. And it gives you readings at different points around the racetrack for consistency to make sure when that hoof hits, it takes readings on how the hoof strikes. He will take soil samples, test those, that will come back, and he'll give us a graph and read out on the different, of course, each soil sample is marked where it was taken around the track, and we can compare our sand, silt, clay readings. And then Mick, he's invaluable. He and I have become friends, but, Mick will tell me if, hey, I think you need to look at this, or you need to change this. If there's an issue, we don't pull any punches with each other. He's been invaluable as an asset. He's kind of a consultant. Also, if he has recommendations, and sometimes I'll say, hey, but this, that works good. We're looking at our water trucks at Churchill. I built a new water truck last year. The spacing on the nozzles is different from the other 2 trucks I have. So this winter I put in the budget we're going to build them all so that all the nozzles are spaced the same. It's those type of consistencies that didn't exist years past, that now the water trucks are all going to put the same volume of water out. If they're going 7 miles an hour around the track, they have the exact same pump, the exact same motor, the exact same nozzle, the exact same spacing on those nozzles. It's those types of things. Mick actually was, we were kind of like, oh, these are on 6-inch centers and these are on 4-inch centers. It's those types of things. And he and I are just looking. I'm helping Fairgrounds build a truck currently, and so it's just those types of things that the consistent, just the getting some,
I think this stuff is fascinating, and I'm sure to a lot of horse players it is, but so I hope it's interesting to everybody, because there's a lot of detail here we can ask about. But when you do, say one of those tools does tell you there's a disparity in the impact on one turn that doesn't exist on the other one, how much can you actually make a difference on a day-to-day basis or a race-to-race basis if you find out that there is a concerning disparity there? Can that be fixed in a day or a race?
Well,
or
he's taking these readings in advance of the meet, and we have come back and added a little bit of silt and clay to richen up, you know, a little bit, you know, where maybe it's getting a little sandier. We had a very wet year last year, and, you know, that might have been, you know, Santa Anita was very wet last winter. So you lose a lot of your fines, your silt and your clays, when you get really wet periods, you know, from 2018 through July of 2019, it was very, very wet.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't had rain now in a month, but prior to that, you know, through July of this year, we were very, very wet. I remember the news saying we hadn't gone a week without rain, significant, you know, a decent rain in 50 weeks or something. And then now, you know, we haven't had anything to speak of in a month, and had very little since Mother Nature shut the faucet off in July.
But there was a tool I saw your guy using out there the other day that I think you use on a daily basis that would be yours and not Mick's. What is
Well,
that?
Mick, actually, we download that into his program, the Going Stick. I believe he was using the Going Stick. So that's specifically for turf, and it has a what would you call it, Mick?
Blade.
A blade on it
Yeah.
that you push into the ground and then you pull it back, and it tests penetration and shear. So the shear, a lot of the root structure would probably have a bearing on the shear. And the penetration is how hard the ground is, whether it's soft. And it will give you a reading, both a penetration reading and then a shear reading. And we will do that at 84 points around the turf course, and then I will download it into Mixed Base.
So there's really two pieces to this, and I kind of alluded to it earlier. One is to make sure you're ready and you've got all the basic things you can't change. You're not going to fix the base if there's a problem between the second and third race. You know what I mean? That's something that you need to know well before you start racing. And
we do
typically
those,
a month.
We do those in advance of the meet, so, you know, yeah, if there's any issues there, we'll fix them. And then, you know, we do moisture readings every day also. So, yeah, you might see it's wet. You know, the TV, I know you're going to talk about shadows, and Chip was talking about shadows. We have that big, huge TV at Churchill. That is a huge shadow issue. Actually, the way the sun sets at Churchill, I see less of an issue with the grandstand shade. That TV is actually
makes
the
total
biggest
sense.
issue we have.
Oh my goodness. Some of these readings that you're taking, I imagine some horse players might be interested in them. Could that information eventually be?
Actually, we have talked and
Going online?
we're looking at trying, you know, how we would share that. So yes, that's being discussed. It's not ultimately my decision. I said, I'm fine. That's up, you know, if you all want to share these numbers, you know, we're trying to be transparent, so I don't think there's anything to hide there.
Just talking about the water trucks just got me thinking about the cost of track maintenance and all of the things that go into it that add up that maybe people don't think about. So let's start first with the water truck, because I think that's fascinating. First of all, you're talking about a piece of equipment that you don't just go to your John Deere dealership and ask them for a racetrack water truck. I mean, how much does something like that cost, and where do you even get one? Or it sounds like you have to customize your own.
They are custom built, yes. I mean, they're sort of like fire trucks are mostly custom built. Water trucks, I mean, you can spend $250,000. I think you can build a good truck in the, you know, $125,000 to $150,000 range. I personally buy late model used cabin chassis. I think it's hard to justify a brand new cabin chassis.
Yeah.
You know, I just bought a truck for fairgrounds. It's got 33,000 miles on it. I got it a lot cheaper than it would have been brand new off the showroom lot. You know, I've actually started using the plastic tanks, you know, with UV protection and plastic. It's lighter, and significantly cheaper, and will last for years. A little racetrack in Maryland I've worked for, I've helped them every year when they have their little meet timonium in Maryland. We built tanks, we built water trucks there with those plastic tanks. They're probably going on 20 years old. The UV protectors and maybe they're not that old, but they're at least 15. I know that. The plastics today are so much better than they used to be. You know, they don't get brittle and cracking. And frankly, at this point, after 15 years, if they do, they're not that expensive. We'll take it off and put a new one on.
Wow. And there's also the mileage that goes on these water trucks and the amount of water. I mean, it wasn't until I was thinking about this panel that it never really occurred to me how much water goes onto a racetrack. And do racetracks pay for that water? I mean,
At Churchill, we
How much-
have 3 big wells, so all the water we use, we can use city water if something was to happen to our system. We have 3 big wells, and we irrigate the turf and use that on the dirt track for watering, so we do not use city water.
okay.
Now, at Pimlico, we did use city water for the turf and the dirt, so their water bill was significant. But yes,
That's why they can't get it in the grandstand.
That's why the toilets won't work.
And then just the sheer wear and tear that goes on these vehicles. I mean, this is, again, not to get lost in the weeds, but we're here to talk about more the business of racing surfaces. I imagine if you're going around a 1-mile track, you know, however many times each day, how often, I mean, how do you even maintain these things, and how long do they last, and what kind of mileage do you put on?
You know, Churchill has been very good because I started there in 2012. We have a lot of old equipment. I think Nick can attest. Over at Trackside, I've got water trucks that, I mean, I shouldn't admit this, but they're from the 80s. But, you know, Churchill's been good. They have a pretty good maintenance program. We've got a good crew over there. You know, if you keep oil changed, grease them, and you take care of them, they will last a long time. Now, you know, we've got newer equipment at Churchill, and we've got some newer trucks, but a couple of the older ones at Trackside, they're getting some age on them. That's kind of where they get shuffled to when we get a new truck at Churchill. But if you take care of things, you know, a well-built truck, they'll last a long time. You know, again, it's grease, you know, making sure it sees a grease done and gets an oil change, and guys are driving it that are responsible.
Okay, I'll stop with my water questions. To get back to what you do with the racetrack to keep it safe on a daily basis, can you just walk us through the various decisions that you have to make every day? Say it's a race day, from the time you get in, preparing it for training that morning, and then the few hours that you have until the races start in the afternoon. I mean, what are all the factors that you are looking at and considering, and what are the most consequential decisions that you make during the day?
It depends on the weather. You know, the turf comes into play. Well, to start off, at 4:30, I've got 2 guys that will come in and open the racetrack, harrow it up. You know, we've sealed it the day before. Again, sealing, I was talking with a rubber tire roller. If the track's fast, we will roll it down and seal it with the rubber tire rollers. That'll help hold moisture in so it's not drying overnight if you get a breeze, or, you know, in the summertime when the sun's up, you know, it's daylight until 9:30 at night. So 2 guys will come in the morning and open it up at 4:30, and they will put a load of water on prior to harrowing it. They'll harrow it up for morning training. And those are 2 of my senior guys, so I trust their judgment. One guy I've got for me, Bruce, I mean, he's excellent, you know. If he really wanted to, I'd probably be working for him. So he's very good. I totally trust his judgment, and if he makes a mistake, I've opened tracks before that I didn't think it was gonna rain. It's pouring rain, so, you know, that's just one of those, you're gonna make judgment calls when you're dealing with Mother Nature, and you're gonna make mistakes, but, you know, as long as you tried, and that's, so anyway, they'll open it up. Our first harrow break is at 7 o'clock, so I get there about 7:15, 10:07 every day before the first break. You know, Mother Nature, we haven't had any rain lately, so we've been putting a lot of water on the track. If we have rain, it's whether we harrow or float. The turf, a lot of times in the morning, the turf becomes an issue. If we're racing and we've had rain, you know, are we off the turf, on the turf? You know, what are we doing there? So that always becomes an issue. And then you get through that, you do the harrow breaks, depending on whether you're watering or sealing, you know, floating. And, you know, a lot of times at 10 o'clock in the morning, we'll finish training, we'll harrow the racetrack. We will re-seal it with the rollers if weather allows us. And we have a conditioner with a blade on it that will true it up. Sometimes we will run that, sometimes I will grade. It just depends on, how much. If I just think it just needs to be trued up, we'll run the conditioner with the blade. So that runs, a conditioner has teeth like a harrow, but it's a heavy harrow, and it's got a leveling blade on the back that will level the material out across. It doesn't really move much, it just kind of will cut little high spots. You know, it doesn't move very much material at all. and then they will re-roll behind the conditioner with the blade and put water on it. You know, it's hard to say how much water this time of year. Normally we're starting to back off on water, but it's been 90 some degrees. We all know it's much warmer than normal, so it feels that it's a little. The days are a little shorter now, so maybe a little less water than July and August, but not a whole lot less right now. Normally this time of year you're down in the 50s at night, and that's when you really start to notice you're putting less water on. But you know, it's been the other morning I'm walking my dogs at 20 after 6. It's 72 degrees. I mean, it doesn't seem like July, or I mean September. It seems like July.
To talk more about this recurring theme of the art versus the science of what you do, you mentioned the big board. I think that's so fascinating that there's a whole segment of the backstretch that isn't getting as much sun as maybe the rest of your main track. And I know from talking to you that there are other small things that happen at Churchill Downs or at other racetracks that perhaps we don't even think about that are affecting the way that you have to maintain it, or maybe even the way it plays. You mentioned the other day that the way that the traffic is in the morning, and how there are certain paths that get more traffic because of gallopers versus workers, and how that has to be evened out. So can you just maybe give us a few more of these small things that we don't read a lot about that you have to account for every day?
Well, Churchill is a 1 mile racetrack, and we have stalls, 1,404 stalls to be exact. And so prior to starting our September meet, we have horses even in the receiving barn. I mean, we're pretty full. The Ellis Park meet has gotten better. A lot of guys are staying home, but even when they did, we were always full with 2-year-olds, young horses, and horses getting fit or running at Ellis. Churchill's pretty much to capacity horse-wise, and so a lot of the trainers will complain the track's getting cuppy, it's getting deep, but it's that middle lane where they gallop. The inside, the work times are still good. We have fewer workers, but the gallop lanes, which are out about 15 feet, 12 to 15 feet off the rail and out for another 12, 15 feet. That lane where the horses want to gallop, it just gets very cut up. By the end of the morning, the hoof traffic is just really working. It's worked the dirt up pretty good. So I struggle with that because actually I think I had said we had richened the track up a little bit with some silt and clay. We had lost a lot with the wet year. And so the track has been very good this summer. I went around and saw some trainers the other day, and everybody seemed pretty pleased with it. But we do struggle. We put a lot of water on Churchill. It takes a lot of water to keep that track tight and hold together in the morning. But with all that traffic, I mean, some of them, I've sat there and looked at them. I'm like, after a rain, we've gotten rain the night before, and then the next day the track's really good, but it does not need water. And I'm like, look, it's not water, it's traffic too. It's the traffic, and I think they realize that to some extent. And I've talked to other people that gallop horses, and one girl I remember saying to me one time, and was one of the most intelligent things I've heard anybody say. She's like, I pick and choose my spots. She stays out a little bit. Always good out there, but some guys, some of the gallop people, and that's part of the trainers. I think they need to, tell their riders, look, stay out a little bit if the going feels a little better there. But that's some of the things we struggle with. Is just trying to get them to realize there's things they can do that would help themselves a little better too.
And that relates also to the afternoons and the perceptions of how a track plays in the afternoons. You see, if you see in the first 2 races of the day that the winners go gate to wire, you have 50 people on Twitter saying that there's a speed bias. How real is that? I mean, I know it's real, but as a track superintendent, is it exaggerated? Are people too quick to judge? Just give me some thoughts on biases from a track superintendent's perspective.
I'm not going to tell you that can't happen. There could be a bias there. I think there's a lot of things you look at. You look at the early fraction times. How did the race set up? If you're going a distance of ground and you go slow early fractions, the horse on the front end is going to have something left at the end of the race. Of course, look on paper. If he was clearly the best horse, he was the even money favorite,
I see something like that, though, I try to look at all that. I mean, I've seen that before, and I'll just tell the guys, we will actually put an extra weight on the inside corner of the harrow to, dig up the inside a little bit if I think it's a little tighter. We seal the whole track. We try to seal it so it's consistent. And when we harrow it up for the first race, we try to make sure that, we have it as even and fair for everybody, for the horses, the trainers, the gamblers, everybody. We're trying to do the best we can and give it, as fair, safe, consistent course as we can.
And you say that you'll hear from trainers in the morning. Is that informal as they gallop by on their horse, or do you have trainers that call you from their cell phones? Or, I mean, how do you? Yeah.
Both. Yeah. So, yeah. No. I mean, it'll be both. I mean, I get phone calls and I'll see them out on the track. I go to the clocker stand and see them. So, usually if I go to the clocker stand and nobody's saying anything, then everything's pretty good. I don't necessarily always walk up and say some of them I will say how are things, and in other ones they'll let me. I know if they see me and they don't say anything, then things are okay because they just said something.
Well, we're going to come back and talk more about your turf course, but I want to include everyone in that discussion. But we do need to talk about that too. But I also want to bring in Chip now to just talk more about the way that the Turfway has become so identified with its surface. And can you just talk more about your experiences with the poly track at Turfway?
Absolutely. First of all, we don't care about water. So that's one thing that's, they have different designations for the track conditions: sloppy, muddy, fast. Is there another one I'm missing? Good. Turfway since 2005 has been fast. So we can paint every single day we've raced for the last 14 years. It's been a fast track. Because of they're talking about floating the track and the crown on the track where they press the water down and it runs to the side. Our poly track is designed differently. So we have pretty much a flat track. There is like a 3% bank in the corners, but it's sitting on top of a very sophisticated drainage system. There's a macadam, which is it looks like it's a black top, but it looks like a Rice Krispie treat on top of about 8 inches of synthetic racetrack. So what we appreciate about it is it pulls the water down and it takes it out through the drainage system. So I've seen our track get our area get inches of water, and our track be just as ready to run right after that rainstorm as it was the day before. So it's really incredible from that point of view. As a matter of fact, the jockeys prefer rain because it holds the kickback down. One of the things we battle, and it was one of those things when you start working, try to under promise and over deliver. You may have heard that. Well, the polytrack folks, when we first got the track, kind of over promised on a couple things, and one of them was kickback, and we've been paying that bill forever. Kickback is what the horses, their hooves fling back on other horses. The first year we had it, I remember Stevens came off of our spiral stakes and he said it felt kind of like snow, like a light snow coming back at him. But our people he said there was going to be zero kickback. There's kickback. We want to fix it. So we went down the rabbit hole of trying different things to fix the kickback. Well, we created kind of more problems than we had. We put too much wax in. It was sticky. It was sticking to the horse's hooves. So we found out that lacking any information, like Dr. Peterson was talking about, any type of methodical approach to trying to figure out what's wrong and to address it, we got ourselves in bigger problems than we used to have. And to this day, kickback is still something that if I get a complaint from a trainer or an owner, kickback is probably it. Our track superintendent, since it's flat, it doesn't move to the center as much as Jamie's track would. There's still that tendency for the material to move in, so he'll have to put the grader on it maybe once every couple weeks. In the dirt days, we used to have 3 shifts on the track continually, making sure, breaking up the dirt clogs, breaking up the ice clogs, continually working it. Now, we groom it once and walk away. You know, after the last race, they groom it once, make it look nice, and they walk away. In very severe weather, we'll have one third shift person continually work the track to make sure that it doesn't get too tight on the bottom. So, you know, we used to have 22, 25 people in our track maintenance crew. Now we have 5, and they seem to handle it just fine. So, again, you know, we were talking about the safety issue, and for people and for animals, you know, it's resolved that. We used to lose weeks and weeks of racing. You know, we handle at night about maybe $1.5 million in wagering from across the country. Of that, we probably realize anywhere from 12 to 9%. You know, we have to split some of that with the horsemen, but you lose a couple weeks of racing, you know, you're in the hole revenue-wise $1 million. So the only time we really lose racing now is when it's just too cold. So we've come to an agreement with the jockeys. We said, okay, here, you know, what's too cold for you guys? And we've made the determination that 5 degrees feels like 5 degrees, so that's with the wind chill incorporated in that and everything else. You go to, you know, weather.com and figure out what that feels like temperature is, and if it's going to drop below 5 degrees, we'll cancel racing before we even start. If it's going to stay above that temperature, we'll race, but we'll kind of mitigate the time that the jockeys have on the track. If it's 7 degrees, you know, we're not going to have a 15-minute long post parade. We'll shorten the post parades down. And in general, by and large, we work with them. You know, a couple times they wanted to quit when it's 14 degrees, and they say, well, this is a really cold 14 degrees. You know, and I'm like, well, what'd you do last night? Because, you know, that might have more bearing on it than the jockeys are, you know, we come to that agreement. So nobody's surprised. Nobody brings their horses. 70% of our horses come from other places. So they come through the receiving barn. So by the time people get on the road and treat their horses and spend all that money, we want to make sure we give them a big a heads up soon enough so they don't have to do all that stuff. And they seem to appreciate it. And it results in maybe four days a year cancellations. And we try to make up those races on the, you know, we add a couple races to the card the rest of the week. So we try to make them up for them as well. You're mentioning, I love to tell this story. I've told this to Mick a few times, but sometimes it's more of an art than a science. I'll never forget the day, our sand in our poly track is very fine white, very light sand. And when we first went to HD for our signal, the horses were coming around the first turn, and this white sand was getting caught by our track lights, and it looked like this huge cloud of, you know, of stuff. And I had this trainer call me, and she was screaming at me. She said, how could you allow anybody to race on that racetrack with that kickback, and they're trying to fight through all that kickback, and she let me have it. And so I called up our video team, and I said, can you pick up the horses on that turn 5 steps later? And so so they did, because the lights weren't refracting off the sand, and it looked fine, and I was like, thanks. So two races later, I get a call from the same trainer. She says, I don't know what you did, but you fixed it. It's completely fixed. So so she was seeing what she was seeing on the TV, but sometimes you just have to understand and manage those perceptions. You know, one of the things we've worked with Mick early on is managing how much water, because our jockeys like us to put water on the racetrack. The problem with putting water on our racetrack is it kind of dilutes and washes away eventually the wax and the oil that are on it. So in a short term, it helps you out. In the long term, it's not healthy for the racetrack. So we try to be judicious when we do it. However, sometimes you just have to do it. You know, people demand it. So what we do now is we've been taking stock of how many times we put water on the racetrack, how many gallons we put on, what the temperature was at that time, how deep the racetrack was, some feedback from the track superintendent that went well, the times were on track, it was running a little slow. So we used all these things, and I used them honestly because I deal with the horsemen at horseman meetings, and they can be difficult. I did it for defensive reasons. I wanted to be able to come in. I knew they're going to complain that the times were slow, or one of the jockeys said that the track is what caused them to win, or something like that. and we wanted to have the facts in front of us. And we've been doing that now for, shoot, I bet 10 years of collecting this data and being able to demonstrate what we've done to the horsemen when they come to ask questions about the track, and that it also helps us out as well. Recently, we had a short spate of horses injured on our surface, and you were asking about the connection with Dr. Peterson's organization. We had this short spate of breakdowns, which is unusual for our track, and so instead of letting it go on, we immediately called these guys up. He sent his person out with the ground penetrating radar, and what we learned was where the tractors were turning, and they were and turning on and off the racetrack, they were just compacting it, and it was not perceptible to an eye. You know, our track superintendent would look at it, and he wouldn't see a dip, or, you know, he got out there and he did his depth testing and everything else, but without that resource, we would have never known that created any type of problem. Not to say that was the reason for it, because those horses didn't necessarily break down right there, but we learned of a problem by pushing the button and making the call, and it helped us out. And you know, after that, we had a hugely successful 3 months.
Chip, another aspect of the business of a synthetic surface is how the horse players respond to it. How has that changed over the years? Is that something you still hear about when synthetic surfaces were at their height? There were a handful of very prominent racing riders that popularized the notion that it wasn't as good to bet for reasons that still aren't entirely clear, but they very much didn't like it.
Yeah.
How has that played out?
You know, I called a guy named Dan Cronin last night. He's Mick Cronin, the ex-UC, I guess he's UCLA's basketball coach now. But Dan is a handicapper at Turfway, and I asked him that question. And you know, I said I knew there was a lot of hostility toward the synthetic surface when it first came out. A lot of trainers didn't like it. A lot of the horsemen used it, I think, to explain away some problems they were having, and I think there were handicappers that didn't like it. Dan's belief is that the handicappers, because the track is so consistent and it's not influenced by weather as much, that it took away some of the easy pickings for the handicappers, like you said, that if they see a fast track, they're betting speed the rest of the day, or if it's a muddy track, you always heard the joke, mudder was a mudder, you know. So they're looking for the horses that run well in the mud. Well, synthetic tracks kind of took a lot of those decisions away from those folks, and it may have made their handicapping a little bit more average. And that's what he believes, and I agree with it. I think over time, and there's also a fair part to that horses have been bred specifically for dirt and for over years and years and years, and new surface that horses haven't been bred to, that the reaction to the surface for different types of horses is unknown, and so a lot of these folks dig right into their statistics when they handicap, like yourself, I'm sure, and try to mine out that information that helps them make the smartest bet. And with the absence of that information on our type of surface, it was probably a little bit more frustrating. So now, over time, 15 years later, there are a handful of synthetic racetracks out there. People can have a greater depth of information to make decisions on their handicapping.
Yeah. And how about the shape of the race? Just I think there's also a perception that jockeys ride it maybe a little bit more like they would on the turf, where they gallop early and then everyone kind of gallops until you get to the quarter pole, and then everyone goes all out, as opposed to as much strategy and not as much passing of horses until you get to the stretch.
And I think that may be true. I think that's a little more true when the track is a little deeper, and when it's not as deep. We've got some pretty sharp jockeys at Turfway, and I noticed that a couple of them, no matter what running number they were, 1 through 12, they always kind of aimed at the same spot. Well, they knew that's where the tractor tire hit when they went around the track to groom, and they felt that that was a tighter piece of the racetrack, and they were running on something a little bit faster than in between the tractor tires. And so
Which path is that?
well, you're gonna have to watch our racing to but that was the explanation I got. And so I asked our track superintendent, can we offset that, make sure that it's not an unfair advantage for anybody, but those guys didn't win every time. So.
And that can make for better racing in some ways too, because there's also a perception that maybe closers have a better chance. I don't know if the statistics prove that out or not, but I think that was one of the things that people used to say, was that it was a more fair for closers. I don't know if you see that.
Because of the hostility, I mean, initially, and I shouldn't say hostility, just because of the unknown and the questions we were getting. We were getting a lot of feedback initially. There was this thing called the polytrack cough, where they thought horses were breathing the stuff and they were having lung problems. And we found out that it was because our polytrack is made out of carpet fibers, rubber, chopped up rubber tires, and treated sand with wax and oil. Did I miss anything on that?
No.
And so they were finding out, believed that these horses were coughing, and it was because there was some minute pieces of fiber that were just at the top of their bronchiole. It wasn't, they were scoping their lungs, and they were actually finding out that there was a lot less in their lungs than when we had the sand and it was being kicked in their face, and they'd find it out there. But we wanted to find out too, is there such thing? We were told that there were a lot of soft tissue injuries. And so we spent 2 years looking at our races, looking at the horses that ran in our races, and found out if any got lost in the black hole, that they never came back. And we did. We found, and we were able to provide this information to the HBPA, the horsemen, and the trainers, and say, because once a rumor gets out there, it's very hard to wrestle it back in. So we provided that information, say, 92% of our horses came back 2 weeks and 3 weeks later. We didn't see any horses failing to come back or drop out of training because of some sort of soft injury, soft tissue injury. So again, the statistics, measurements, all that stuff is what provides you the information to improve upon a surface and improve upon the right things. If we just listened to rumor and reacted to it, kind of like we did with the kickback, you'll end up fixing a problem you don't have, or creating a bigger problem than one you didn't even know about. So it's working with Mick and his crew it's been money for us for a long time.
Well, we're going to open it up for questions in a moment, but there have been several references to the winter meet at Santa Anita, and I did want to give everybody a chance to share whatever thoughts they might have. And I guess the specific question I'll ask is, in light of the heightened scrutiny on racing this year, what are the specific changes to your methods or processes that you've made in the past 6 months, specifically in response to Santa Anita? If anybody has any that they care to share.
Yeah, no, it's agonizing watching that go on out there, and it's a tough situation. Mick mentioned that they're multi-factorial, which means did that injury result? The first thing people blame is a racing surface. So these guys have to be ready to and prepared to defend that. But what we found out with the injuries we've had, we had a meeting after with the necropsy, which is kind of like their the after-death investigation from the veterinarians. You'd find out that there was a hidden problem with the horse that wouldn't manifest itself in the horse pain, or it was a bone condition or something like that. So those things were very important to us to understand why something may have happened. At Turfway, we didn't change a whole lot because we have a good experience. We made sure that if we didn't believe the racetrack was ready, we'd cancel racing. There was a couple times after 15 years we found we were holding a little water in a certain area, and so we just wouldn't race on it and we'd cancel it. And it's a easy price to pay than having to explain yourself out like the poor people in Santa Anita have to. Other than that, we defer to the experts. You know, we defer to the veterinarians who, Kentucky veterinarians do a great job of pre-race examinations and warm-up examinations, and they scratch horses at the gate. I'm fine with it. You know, if they've identified a horse that's not moving to their satisfaction, get them out of there, you know. So they do a good job. I think our horsemen, I think Mick will agree with this, our horsemen are on the lower end of the spectrum right now. We don't give a lot of money away in purses, so by definition our horses aren't very good, you know, for mostly, you know, as you talk about competing for different dollars. And our horsemen have to take care of those animals for their well-being, and they take care of them because they're passionate about them and they love them. And so between the commission, our track superintendent, and the veterinarians, I think we have just a great synergy of people that are looking out for the horse, and we just make sure as a track manager that we don't do anything to encourage pushing horses into races that don't need to be racing as soon because we're trying to fill races. You know, telling our racing department it's okay. You got a six horse field. It's okay. You know, we don't beat them over the head to get 8 horses in there, and 2 of them might be sore or might not be ready to return to racing. So that's my job, is to make sure nobody feels pressure or threatened to do something that would be unsafe in any part of the racetrack, but especially as it relates to putting the animals on the track.
And Mick said at the top that the Del Mar meet proves that a dirt surface can be as safe as a synthetic surface or the safest surfaces of all types. What changes out there do you think allowed that, both with the surface and maybe the increased vet checks and other things? But you being the surface expert, I guess I'd prefer to hear more about what specifically they did to the surface.
Sure, and you know, we're in an interesting point right now because there was an investment a little over a decade ago in the equine injury database, and the first of the papers have come out from that, Georgopoulos and Parkins, and then there's a meta-analysis that Hitchens from Melbourne has done. So, as an engineer, it sounds kind of weird, but I see the roadmap for the safety of the horses and riders to be using the equine injury database to identify where we need to devote more resources in racing. What really stands out on both turf and dirt surfaces is the good years are good and there's more variation between years. Now, I think it's pretty clear, and what we see on the synthetics is every year is pretty good. Even the synthetics that don't have quite as good of safety record, it is quite consistent from year to year. So doing a simple thought experiment and knowing a little bit about the racetracks, it's not like they have stupid years and smart years on the superintendents, the crew. It's not like the equipment suddenly has a good year and then a bad year. What we really have to look at is our adaptation to weather on both turf and dirt. And so that's a lot of where our focus is. If we go beyond the surfaces, I think Chip stated it very clearly. We really need to look at the culture. And it's when you see top management telling the superintendent, if you see something, you know, that's the saying, if you see something, say something. And then what happens at Turfway is, if it's holding water in an area because there's some maintenance that needs to be done on the track, what do? You cancel racing. Or the equivalent is, you scratch the horse when you see the horses loading in the gate, there's a problem. And I think that's the team effort, but a lot of this can be driven by the epidemiology. And this is really a long-term commitment for the sport to look at that.
Jamie, I'll give you the final word on that. You oversee the most watched racetrack in the world. Have there been any alterations to your process, or how much have you been talking about what happened in the spring out west?
Yeah, I mean, myself, with the scrutiny going on, I've just, you know, I don't just proofread my work one time. I'm proofreading everything I do 2 and 3 times guys that have a lot of experience, and they'll tell me, it's wet up in this turn, or it's getting deep in the middle, and luckily we've had a really good meet. We had a great spring meet. We had almost 3,200 starters. We had one musculoskeletal catastrophic. We've just run 3 days in September with 0. So, we're probably getting up into the close to 3,400 plus starters, and we've had one. I think that's a good number. I'm really happy. They had the Del Mar meet that was really successful. Dirt tracks can be safe, but they're challenging. I mean, they you really have to dot your I's and cross your T's and just stay on top of everything. I know my weaknesses and my strengths. The one thing is I'm not lazy. If the track needs to be graded, I'll grade. Now, answering an email or doing a report, for corporate, I get an email and 2 days later I'm like, shoot, I forgot to answer that email.
We'd rather you were working on the track.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why I'm able to be here today, because it's sure not because I'm efficient in the office. You see my desk, paper's this high, but, one thing I've got a great crew, and we have just been vigilant, and, there was a report, we had a great spring meet, so the Kentucky Racing Commission, it was noted, and the vets scratched 33 horses this spring, 19 the year before. So I thought that was, everybody's being vigilant. But, then I was talking to, and I think Chip, said the state vets do a great job in Kentucky. They're great. Have a good rapport with them, and they're great guys and lady women. I was talking to one of them the other day, and they said that, they're seeing, fewer issues with horses. They're, I think the trainers realize that, they can't push the envelope. It's multifaceted from, trainers not pushing the envelope, the vets, if they see something, doing something, and us making sure that the track is in as good a shape as it possibly can be. And knock on wood, we've had a great, meet this year, at Churchill so far. 2020's been great. Hopefully we can continue that.
Very good. Well, gentlemen, thank you for your insights. We will open it up for questions for a few minutes, and Sean maybe has even gotten some from some of our online
Actually,
viewers.
if you'll raise your hand if you have a question, I'll come over to you and you can ask it on the mic.
So I'm curious how close to real-time information we are, and what needs to happen to make the information real-time. I mean, are there little bitty sensors that need to be implanted in Chip's drainage system, or what's the next step to make the information real-time?
We've got some of the prototypes of some of the pieces will be tested at Santa Anita before Breeders' Cup. So we're to the point now where we're beginning to look at. I mean, the emphasis right now, the emphasis on real-time information is is really on moisture of the track, and because the track's harrowed, or you aerate the turf course heavily in a lot of thoroughbred tracks, we can't embed things, so it all has to travel with the equipment, and so but we're prototyping that, and then beginning to look at network technologies that'll allow it to communicate, and the GPS coordinates have already been operational in some of the tracks, although right now we're kind of in a gap on that, but we're there, and we're moving forward, and it's kind of an exciting time from that standpoint.
Can you talk about the prototypes at all?
Sure. Well, our first step is let me tell you the simplest part of this is improving the quality of the data we have already. Right now, most of the tracks measure cushion depth. When Jim was talking about track bias, I mean, one way to create a track bias is to not pull the rail where you have dirt that piles up just inside the path of the harrow, and so it'll pile up there, and in your worst case scenario, the harrow will ride on that pile of dirt, and there will be a gap that's untouched, and then it'll dig in further up on the track, because keep in mind the track's got a bank or a crossfall in the straight or a bank, So what a number of the tracks, especially the shallow sand tracks like the New York tracks, they'll measure the cushion by hand every day with a ruler, and then also take their moisture measurements, and then they'll map that out. One of the first tools we've got that's being used is it uses GPS on the tool to get the location. It's got a moisture sensor that's a time domain reflectometry moisture sensor, and it measures the cushion depth. So that's one of the prototypes that's being tested out at, it's been tested, trying to think, it was tested once, and we've got the prototype going out to Santa Anita. The other one is the moisture sensor, which would go right on the harrow, and that turns out to be a fairly difficult problem to get a dirt moisture sensor. Most moisture sensors are done with optical, near infrared or other optical ranges, and the horse weighs 1,000 pounds and is going 40 miles an hour, so we care about the moisture content 4 inches down. So we can't use a lot of the agricultural moisture sensors, so we're working with a couple different partners on that, on the moisture sensors. So those are the priorities. The other piece is we've got weather stations at all the tracks, which give us basic weather data, rainfall and humidity, and we have a preliminary evaporation model from the tracks that runs, and then GPS, of course, on all the equipment. Right now, poor Jamie has equipment manually into the database that every time a piece of equipment goes out on the track, Jamie knows what's there, he tracks it, and he enters it into the database or his assistant. So again, automating that. So we're moving forward in that direction, but it's and the technology is actually pretty exciting right now. It's gotten smaller and cheaper.
And who's backing that research and development? Who are we talking about?
Well, it's been partly, it's actually partly. We're not a very profitable entity in the racing services testing laboratory, but everything we do gets plowed into that. It's a nonprofit. And then the Kentucky Equine Drug Research Council provided funding for the moisture sensor work that we're doing. And, if you want to get involved, meet me after the
Sean's passing the hat around.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting because, I mean, it's a huge safety opportunity to improve the safety of the racetrack, real-time information.
Got a question from our friends at Murray State. This probably goes out to you, Chip. They asked, are all the poly tracks built the same, i.e. base, materials, etc.?
Well, I may throw this over to Dr. Peters, but I think so.
Yeah, the Hollywood Park surface was done with a geotextile over what they call decomposed granite base. Most of them are the porous macadam, which is just a porous asphalt. It just doesn't have the fine particles like Chips is. 2 of the poly tracks have been retrofitted with a geotextile over the top of the macadam because the macadam is broken up. But we're talking the basic composition. There's actually the different tracks vary quite a bit in composition, so it matters actually more which version you have than it does which manufacturer, because it's changed quite a bit.
Thanks, Mick. Looks like we have time for one more question. Bill?
So, maybe, do you have any, this is for Dr. Peterson, do you have any analytics or predictive models that take a look at the equine injury database and then look at the data in terms of pre-race exams, number of pre-race exams, number of, vet scratches, number of readings around the track, frequency of harrowing, just data that you can aggregate to do predictive best practices in terms of, what best practices are to prevent injuries?
That, for me, is really the holy grail, and that's really where we're headed. The quality of most of our data taken from the tracks is still relatively low quality. Present company accepted.
It used to be no data.
It used to be no data.
We're growing.
We do. What's important on this is because the risks are multi-factorial, what we've seen with the equine injury database is, you know, it really took 6 years of data before things became statistically significant, because there are far too many catastrophic injuries. And keep in mind, the equine injury database is just catastrophic injuries, which is defined with the horse that's euthanized within 72 hours of the incident on the racetrack. But there are so many factors that can cause the catastrophic injury that, because as you start slicing it up, there's not very many that go in bucket A, bucket B, and bucket C. And as a bucket B person, I need a lot of tracks for a lot of years to be able to see which part of bucket B matters. We've begun to look at some things that we're beginning to see good results from. The questions that would seem obvious and we're not getting obvious answers to is radius of turns, banking, the work by Dragopoulos and Parkin and Edinburgh looked at type of surface, and they looked at off surface versus good surface. You know, they just had 2 categories in order to get enough readings in their bucket. And interestingly enough, with 6 years of data, which is about 2.5 million starts, they said track surface condition doesn't matter. Which is, I think that's really compelling. That's not an answer that you'd expect. We know that weather matters, but we also don't know, we've also got an indication that the track condition doesn't matter. So I think the answer probably comes from how we transition from wet to dry and then challenging decisions that are made. So I'm going to go back one more time to real-time moisture measurements and my own personal obsession in life. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap it up. That's our last question. Byron, if you have one, you're welcome to come down and talk to our panelists afterwards. Let's have a round of applause for these guys. That was a wonderful talk. And just to remind everybody, we'll be back here on October 9th to do this again. We'll have the night with the legendary Tom Durkin, which surely will be entertaining. You're going to want to come to that. And then on November 13th, another Wednesday night, we'll be back for our last in the fall series, where we'll talk about sports wagering and horse racing. Can they coexist? So join us for those events. Thanks again for coming, everyone.